Hi, welcome to our first episode of the Marti and Me Club with Stitchin Tree Quilts. I'm Teresa Kanan, owner of Stitchin Tree Quilts, and we welcome you to our monthly club. Each month for the next 6 months, we'll be exploring one of Marti Michelle's patterns and one of her template series in our From Marti and Me Club. The pattern series are exclusive to the Marti and Me Club, and we'll explain what you need to know as we go along. The quilt that we'll be working with this month is a simple table runner called Bali Breezes. This is one possible layout for the Bali Breezes table runner. It is not complete yet, but by the time we finish this episode, we'll have the final 4 blocks ready to go. It's very simple and easy to make. Watch along and I'll show you how. First, let's start by exploring the pattern, Bali Breezes by Marti Michelle. This pattern is exclusive from Marti and Me clubs, and since we're the only club in Western Iowa, it's exclusive to our shop. Now, I encourage you to take notes and write them in your pattern. If you don't like to write notes in your pattern, grab a pad of sticky notes and write them on the sticky note and include them inside. One reason why I encourage people to write in their patterns is simply because that way when they work on the same kit or quilt again, they've got the notes that they've taken the first time around. Start by opening up your pattern and we'll walk through it page by page. Let's begin by opening your pattern, Bali Breezes. This pattern is the first pattern that we'll be using with our From Marti and Me Club. It is exclusive to the Marti and Me Club and includes instructions for a table runner, wall hanging, double, and queen size quilt. Open your pattern and follow along with me, please. We'll begin by looking at the pictures on page 2. The pictures in the top side, the top left-hand corner, show different ways you can lay out the table runner. That's what we'll be working with this month in our Marti and Me Club. At the bottom of the page, it shows 2 different pictures for the wall hanging. That's also a very intriguing look. On page 3, Marti explains why she wants to use templates and how the templates will help us in making this block. Traditionally, to make this particular block, we would have cut a half square triangle, several strips, pieced them together, and tried to make them into a square. Marti's going to show you that it's a very easy way, using her template ruler, to make it in one simple technique. Marti encourages us to use very low contrast fabrics, and that's why she chose to use batiks for hers. For the purpose of our Marti Michelle Club video, I used a higher contrast red, white, and blue, and find that makes very nice looking blocks that allow us to see from a distance on the video just exactly how this block goes together. Let's turn to page 4. On page 4 and 5, Marti explains to us the importance of cutting on the lengthwise grain of fabric. It's interesting, many of us may have been quilting for some time but might not know very much about fabric grain. I'll explain a little bit about fabric grain using a demonstration that Marti showed us when we were at our grand ruler training. On pages 4 and 5 of Marti's pattern, she discusses at length the importance of understanding grain line. When we purchase fabric, we purchase it on the bolt, and it's usually 44 to 45 inches wide. Typically, we have a fold side, and we have a selvage side. Along the selvage side is considered the length of fabric. From selvage to selvage, it is considered the width of fabric. We are accustomed to cutting most of our strips from the width of fabric. But as Marti points out, in the width of fabric, we have more stretch than what we do in the length of fabric. Watch as I demonstrate. This is width of fabric. See how it stretches? This is length of fabric. Little or no stretching. And of course, as we all know, the crosswise grain, which we typically call the bias, is where we have the most stretch. That's why we tend to use bias binding when we're trying to bind around curves. For the purpose of all of our cutting, almost, with Marti Michelle templates, she's going to have us cut our strips from the length of fabric. You'll find that when we cut our strips for our piecing from the length of fabric, it will have very little stretch to it, very little stretch in that length of fabric at all. That's what allows us to do our piecing so that it pieces and it irons straight. Have you ever ironed a strip set together and it ended up in a rainbow arc? You might consider that that's because you've cut from the width of the fabric as opposed to the length of the fabric. Marty's first instruction for us is to take that 1.25 yards each of our solid fabric and cut the selvage from one side of that. Once we do that, we will fold the fabric in place just like we would if we'd had it done with a regular 45-inch fabric. So we're still dealing with the same length, only now we'll be cutting our fabric from the length of fabric as opposed to the width of fabric. Why does Marti ask us to leave the selvage only on one side? That way then, when we put the fabric back into our stash, we will still have the selvage edge to show on the opposite end of the fabric, and we'll always know where our length of fabric is. Once we cut both selvages off, it's impossible to tell which one is length of fabric and which one is width of fabric without stretching the fabric to see.
On page 6, Marti tells us why she'll have us cutting our strips of fabric on the lengthwise grain for today's project. She tells us to make the strip sets, and I'll explain more about how to put those strip sets together later in the episode. Page 7 demonstrates the strip sets. On page 8, Marti tells us how to press our strip sets, and I will demonstrate that later on the video, and how to check our strip width for our strip set. She then shows us how to cut our bias strips using our strip set as a measuring tool. Again, I will demonstrate that later on the video. She explains to us on page 10 how to cut our triangles, and then on page 11 starts to tell us how to arrange our blocks. These are 3 different arrangements for our table runner. On page 12, she gives us the directions for our last strip set and how we can use it to complete the table runner. She also gives us an example on page 13 on how to finish our table runner using a no binding method. On page 14, Marti shows us our design option of adding the V points to the end of the table runner. And enclosed in the center of your pattern is a paper copy of the Marti Michelle template. You're certainly welcome to use that paper copy to make your own template, but I really encourage you to purchase her template set simply because with all the lines necessary on this particular template, it's a difficult template to try to reproduce on your own. The remaining of the book are different instructions for how to make this particular block, the Bali Breezes block, and use it in a wall hanging or throw or larger quilt. There, that's the pattern. Now let's get started on our project. On page 6 of the pattern, Marti begins by having us cut our strip sets. We will need to have 4 strip sets of 5 fabrics each, cut from 27 inches length of fabric. Those strips are 1.5 inches each, and a person might think that they don't want to cut that from the length of fabric because they might feel that it wastes quite a bit of fabric. But keep the rest of the fabric for your stash, or cut the fabric for your friends and you have several matching table runners. Or, of course, you can always make the larger quilt as well. The purpose to having the variety of the fabric is so that in our blocks we'll have some variety and with the different fabrics that we choose. Marti encourages us to use a low contrast fabric, but you can see here I chose a high contrast, particularly for video purposes. Once I finished the actual quilt blocks though, I liked it with the high contrast. Choose your 5 strips at random and put them together, stitching them into a 5-strip set. In the instructions, Marti encourages us to take those 5 strips and to engineer the corners initially in order to make those pieced together easily into the 5-strip sets. Look at the picture on page 7. I attempted that method, but I found that did not work very well. I still had to use the tool to cut the strip set when I finished. Instead, I used the method that she showed on the second picture, which had us stagger the strips exactly somewhere between 3/4 and 1 inch apart. I stitched my strips together and then I pressed them. I'll demonstrate our pressing technique. Here you see the 5 strips that are set together. Marti would encourage us to use the strips and to press them instead of turning them on our ironing board lengthwise that we would typically do, to turn them and to do them crosswise on our ironing board. Do you press with steam? If you do, you're probably stretching your fabric. So your first lesson is to shut the steam off of your iron. I take my fingers and I hold the fabric apart, and you just press in one direction, starting in the middle of my strip unit, and then I keep working my way to the outside edge. If you pull those fabrics apart with your fingers, you'll get a nice even seam. When you finish, you want the strip set to lay straight and flat. Notice how I don't have any rainbow or arcing. That is because we cut this fabric from the lengthwise grain of fabric. Now it's time to measure our strip width. If we had used perfect 1/4-inch seams and our pressing is good, our strip unit should measure 5 1/2 inches. Lay your ruler on top of your strip and check your measurement. I can see that in a few places I'm short of my 5 1/2 inches. So the first thing I have to check is my pressing. Again, now I'll press from the front of the unit, and I can see that I did not have my unit fully pressed open. Pressing is usually our first culprit. If the pressing doesn't answer your problems, there, now I have a 5 1/2-inch strip set. If the pressing doesn't answer your problems, then it's in your 1/4 inch. Either make adjustments to your 1/4 inch, or we'll make adjustments when we actually get our sets together.